Hello, I'm John David Ebert, and welcome to the second lecture of our third week of our course in Understanding Contemporary Art. Now we're talking about the post-World War II German artists, and last time we did a quick introductory flyby of some of the most significant of the post-World War II German artists. And for the next three lectures, what we'll do is to look in some detail at perhaps the greatest and certainly the most influential of those artists, Joseph Beuys. Now, I think his work lends itself to a sort of threefold packaging in the sense that he has a sort of pre-Dusseldorf period, a Dusseldorf period, and a post-Dusseldorf period. The pre-Dusseldorf period extends from about 1948 with his earliest drawings and sculptures and so forth down to about 1960. He became professor of monumental sculpture at Dusseldorf in 1961, where he taught until about 1972, when he left in a bit of a scandal. And then the post-Dusseldorf period that continues on down to his death in 1986. So what I want to do then is move into a discussion of his works. Now, there's a myth that Beuys fabricated in 1979. During World War II, he was a fighter pilot, and his plane was a Stuka that was shot down in the Crimea. But Beuys's interpretation of what happened seems to diverge from the reality of the events. What he said was that he was rescued from his plane by Tartar tribesmen, nomads that came along, these herdsmen, and they rescued him. And they wrapped him in felt and in fat, layers of fat and felt, which is significant because those are two of the main substances that Beuys will later use in the works of his mature period. And they regenerated him and brought him back to life, and they wanted to make him one of their own tribesmen, but he refused and then went back to Germany. But apparently eyewitnesses say that he was actually rescued by German commandos and that this was all a fabrication made up by him. But what's significant about it, though, is that what Beuys is doing is plugging himself into the myth of the shaman. He had this idea of the artist as a shaman, and the shaman is always the one who is set apart as the result of something significant that happens to him or her. An animal might attack them, let's say, or there might be an accident. Something marks them and sets them apart as an individual who has been selected by the ancestors to undergo the ordeal of a vision quest of some sort. And Beuys is simply plugging himself into that myth in order to highlight his idea of his self-portrayal of himself as an artist shaman. Which is not a terribly contemporary art thing to do. It's more of a modernist type of thing. But I think we'll see as we look through Beuys's works that there's a kind of mixture of modernist elements with contemporary art. But no one defines contemporary art, I think, better than Joseph Beuys. His early works here, this is a work from 1949 called Sheep Skeleton. We'll move right into the works here. And you can see that he has rendered a sheep skeleton as though it's a sort of visual pun on a sheep skeleton and the pupa of an insect. If we look here at an insect's pupa, this is a pupa whereby the insect wraps itself in a kind of cocoon and prepares for the process of transformation. And we look back at Beuys's sheep skeleton, you can see the similarity to the pupa, indicating that the sheep is metamorphosing into something else. This is a very shamanistic thing, part of the cosmology of shamanism, that sort of becoming's animal. There's a shuttling back and forth from the human world to the animal world, and back from the animal world to the human world that is both characteristic of shamanism and also characteristic of what I would term Beuys cosmology A, which is the period of his art from 1948 to about 1960. In this second work, this is a sculpture of his from 1964 called Animal Woman. And you can see that it is clearly modeled on Paleolithic works of art, such as this one. This is the famous Venus of Les Pugues. So this is the Great Mother. And as with Jackson Pollock, we saw with the early modernist art of Jackson Pollock that the two great archetypes there were the shaman and the goddess, the Great Mother. So too, I think the same thing can be said of the artwork of the early period of Joseph Beuys, where the shaman and the archetype of the Great Mother are the bodies that form the surfaces of inscription upon which he inscribes the signifiers of his early work. The human body itself is the canvas, the surface of inscription for the cosmology, the first cosmology that he invents for himself up until about the period of 1960. This is Virgin, a little sculpture from 1952 that he did that evokes a kind of Neolithic figurine. Here's a great Neolithic figurine from Cucuteni, from the site of about 5000 BC, from the site of Cucuteni, which is a schematized goddess. And here we can see that the interesting thing about this image, this little sculpture of this figurine, is that it's wrapped in bandages, which tends to indicate that there's an emergency. So he's retained from ancient archaic cosmology the transcendental signified of the goddess mother, but now she's appearing on the surface of a dirty, used pillow, and she's wrapped in bandages, which indicates that the situation now is dire. So the situation with these ancient transcendental signifieds is that of an emergency, and I think we can see with Boyce here that he's working with materials that look as though they've been retrieved from the scrap heap of a damaged age. He too, like Robert Rauschenberg, is fishing out of the metaphysical scrap heap of the dismantled metaphysical age, which has resulted from a massive catastrophe. Of course, this is a post-catastrophic art that indicates that the basic morphogenetic field of the West, the processes, the morphogenic processes of form production actually have been damaged by the catastrophe of World War II itself. And so now it can only produce badly damaged forms, aesthetically mangled, ruined, wrecked, used forms. And so Boyce has a tendency here to use used materials, recycled materials, damaged scraps, sheets of paper and envelopes that have already been written on as surfaces of inscription for this early work. Here's another example of that. This is a drawing that he did called The Table from 1952, and you can see there are notes all over it. And he's just sort of put this form on there in an ad hoc manner. This is Actrice from 1956, and the top of the paper has been torn across deliberately by Boyce, again indicating that there's a problem now with the form-producing faculties of the West after World War II. All of its aesthetic forms are damaged. They exist in post-traumatic stress mode, where the signifiers are produced in such a way that they are not quite healthy. There's something sick about them. This is another one of his drawings. Boyce is a multimedia artist, and you can see him here in his early period drawing, painting, sculpting. He's reaching out in all of these different directions, looking for the medium that will work best for him. He is a conceptual artist, a multimedia artist. This is Pregnant Woman with Swan of 1959. Once again, we have the goddess as the sort of apparatus of semiotic capture, upon which and inside which he is inscribing these early signifiers. And he's creating a kind of cosmos of forms, animals and humans, humans cycling into animals, containing animals, animals transforming into humans, human beings devolving into animals, and so forth. This constant process with all of these cosmic energies that are coming in from a kind of post-Goethean inheritance via Rudolf Steiner. Boyce was heavily influenced by the work of Rudolf Steiner, as we see in this next work. This is a sculpture in bronze called Queen Bee from 1958, which is a sculpture that plays with Rudolf Steiner's riff on bees, where Steiner talked about bees, and here is the drawing for that makes it a little clearer. It's kind of hard to see in the actual sculpture, but the drawing, I think, for the sculpture makes it very clear. And he's drawing a deliberate analogy here, once again, to the human body, where Rudolf Steiner had said that bees are analogous to the human blood cells, and they form the hexagonal lattices inside the honeycomb in direct analogy to the way the red blood cells form the hexagonal lattices of the bones inside the human bones. And so there's a direct analogy. And so he's always referring back, using Rudolf Steiner's cosmology to refer back to the human body. The human body is the cosmology, the apparatus of capture for Boyce Cosmology A. But long about 1958, it begins to disintegrate. He went through a depression in between 1955 to 58, and during that period he did some interesting works, and that early cosmology now begins to liquefy, dismantle, and to be dissolved. This is Death in the Maiden, which is ominously inscribed, characteristically on a used manila envelope, but ominously inscribed with the address of Auschwitz on the side of it. And indeed, at this time, as we see here in this installation, he created one of his first great installations, the Auschwitz installation, between 1956 and 1958. And this now begins to announce not only the transition into his mature period with all the vitrines and installations that he does, but it also indicates the liquefaction and meltdown of the human body, which had formed the surface of inscription for Cosmology A. Nowhere do we find the human body. It is now conspicuous by its absence, and what it is left behind now in the detritus of these remains from the concentration camp are the traces, are simply traces left behind by where there used to be human figures but are gone now. We find used sort of sausages, a hot plate with hunks of fat, and fat will become one of the primary substances that he uses in his mature period. We've got a map and maybe some shoelaces and all these discarded bits and pieces of things that indicate a struggle for individuals who are trying to survive under very stressful circumstances. And so the Holocaust, I think, was nothing if not a kind of eschatology of the disintegration and meltdown of the human body. The human body was simply thrown onto the pyre, pulled apart, disassembled, and dismantled in a very vicious and industrially efficient, ominous manner. And I think it's interesting that Boyce sort of reinscribes himself through the Holocaust as a way of melting down his first cosmology, where the primary surface of inscription, as we have seen, was the goddess, the shaman, and the various animals such as bees, swans, cows, goats, and the Becomings animal, and the cosmic circuits between the human and the Becomings animal. And now the human element begins to be dissolved, liquefied, and dismantled, and what is left now is a cosmology of traces, which will form the primary cosmology now of his middle period, a cosmology of traces and of cosmic powers. He will retain from the influence of Rudolf Steiner upon him vast impersonal cosmic forces that are at work in the human cosmos, and those will become the protagonists of the mature art of his middle period next, as we will see, not the human form any longer, as we will see next.